Hello and welcome to the LinkedIn version of my GitHub Actions walkthrough, experiences, uh, woes and learnings by using GitHub Actions for about 1 month using this particular workflow, right? This is aimed at managers and people who are looking at GitHub Actions and are a bit on the fence about it and kind of wondering what the benefits are, what the discernments are, that sort of thing. Okay, so what is GitHub Actions? GitHub Actions is a CI/CD tool, and it essentially allows you to run the pipeline to create an application. So I'll put that in terms that make more sense. You see how I have this chicken, and it has some, nice characteristics, like it's, cooked for one, and it also has some vegetables around, right? So if you think about it as the recipe to make the chicken, things become a lot easier. Now, within a recipe, there are steps, right, that you can use to create the chicken, to create the application, in our case, in terms of the context that we're talking about, and also to create the code that we need to give our customers more innovation, more speed, velocity, that all those good stuff, right? So why do we want to use it? Well, first of all, it gives us a nice little kind of output as to what's going on in our code. We can see what's happening at each individual step of the code. These are steps of the code, and it works for our job. So the job that we're running, right, is the workflow itself. So if I look at the workflow file here in the output, what we can see is that there's a lot of stuff happening at any one point, and depending on success or failure, something is going to happen, right? That's all we care about at the very high level. And essentially, if you click on Actions, we can see that there are different files here which run to do different things. In my case, this is to create a Kubernetes cluster, which will then have Helm charts, which will then create my website and enable me to launch my WordPress or whatever I want to do, right? That's basically what this is for. Okay, that's in a very, very nutshell thing. So in my experience with GitHub Actions, I found it to be quite useful. And the reason why is because if I click on one part of the code, I can see kind of what's happening with that particular part. So if I'm looking at this particular YAML file, the good thing about it is that it's written in YAML, which means yet another markup language. And on top of that, because it's written in YAML, I can transfer those skills that I've used within by working with this code to things like Kubernetes, to things like Prometheus, to different tools that also use YAML as well, right? So it makes it easier. So that's a good point. What's the other good point? Well, I can also use secrets. So if I go to settings and I go to secrets and variables and I go down to actions, these are the secrets which I'm using in my workflow, right? I don't have to go to AWS, use Secrets Manager, use a HSM to encrypt the secret again. Right? How long? Has its own advantages. I'll be honest, right? It has its own advantages because I can then utilize the Terraform in order to put the secret there, right? If I'm using AWS, or if I'm using Azure or GKS, doesn't really matter. But I'm cheap, right? I don't like spending money on secrets. So I've done it this way and just put it all in there because I know it's going to be safe. I know that I can call it later. I can recite my variables if I need to. Right? I don't have any in this repository because they're all created on the fly. And on top of that, one cool thing about GitHub Actions is that you have Dependabot. Dependabot allows you to update your code, essentially. You can update the version of your modules which you're releasing. It's one thing that we did back in the corporate world. And we also use GitHub Actions to get rid of things like Jenkins because a lot of engineers, including myself, don't like using Jenkins because it's very difficult to kind of understand after a certain point. I've heard from people who have 20 years in the 20 years in the field that it gets very difficult to understand Jenkins after a certain point. So rather than do all that, GitHub Actions, it's good because you can get up to speed with it pretty quickly. I've come from not knowing anything to knowing a little bit more about it within about a month of using it, just straight, pretty much nearly every day. Yeah. So that's one of the things that you can do with GitHub Actions. Pretty easy to use, has webhooks, you can create custom pages. You can even look at issues. So if you're, having Jira, then you can look at it from here and create an issue. You can create milestones, all your typical Jira stuff as a manager, you can put down here, right? So any issues, anything like that, pretty cool. Yeah, that's basically it, but just a couple of things I think I've forgotten is that you can have your own runners. So a GitHub runner is one of two things. Basically, it's a machine that you can run either in the cloud, on premises, or using GitHub themselves, right? They host their own runners. So the way that I like to think about a runner is it looks at the job, like me, I'm looking for jobs, and it looks at the criteria and says, okay, cool, I'm going to take that job, 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 because they're all coming in to a central location, which is the candidate themselves, right? So he's looking for a job, gets his paper out, says, yeah, I have this, I have this, I have this, I have this, this is my criteria. But rather than going for an interview, rather than doing all of that stuff, he just says, I'm going to accept the job. He doesn't care about the interview phase. He doesn't care about any of all that stuff. All he cares about is, does he match the criteria? If so, do I have the dependencies? Do I have the software which is installed on this runner? If so, continue. If not, raise it. Okay, a self-hosted runner, same thing, except we host it ourselves. Yeah? Now, as a manager, you might be thinking, well, that sounds expensive. Why would I want to do that? Well, reason being is because you can then protect your content. If you're working with confidential information, you can self-host it and say, right, okay, I don't want it leaked to the public because this is confidential to the organization, and therefore we can be financially liable if something bad was to happen. Example, intellectual property. Yeah? So that's the reason why we would use something like a self-hosted runner, because if we're dealing with confidential data, it's probably best it's kept inside of the organization, in our own periphery, in our own control, and it would help with things like our shareholders, people like that, for example, our managers, our CEO, directors, now they're all happy, things of that nature. So if I was in a managerial position, how would I justify this? How would I justify the investment to go from Jenkins to GitHub Actions? Very simple. We can increase the velocity at which we put our application in the market because we have the ability to now utilize a standard workflow. That's basically how I would word it. And the CEO might think, that doesn't really make much sense. What do you mean by that? Well, we can save money because now we don't have to train people as much to use an inbuilt a tool which takes a long time to learn, right? It's essentially that we can get a standard workflow because now the tools that we're using are all written in the same language. So it's a bit like me saying, I want to use English to write. I want to use English to not only write in English, but I can also read in English, which saves me time. If I'm going to go from English to Arabic or Thai or Tagalog or something like that, now I've got to think about how I'm going to translate those words from English to Tagalog, Thai, or whatever else, right? As an example. So that's the beauty of using something like GitHub Actions over something like Jenkins, right? Less time, easier to learn, easier to use, able to deploy with secrets, able to get information out if we need to, set variables. We can do all of that. It's pretty similar to the way that we would use Jenkins. The only difference is that it's easier to use because it's written in YAML, and we use YAML quite regularly in the industry because it's standardized, as opposed to using something like Jenkins, for example, right? So that's a very brief overview of GitHub Actions. And if you want more information, feel free to contact me. I'm available immediately for hire. So if you've gained value or knowledge from this, let me know. Hit like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. Hit me up on LinkedIn, and let's discuss some opportunities which are out there. As I say, I'm immediately available for hire. This is just something that I've done in my spare time, but hopefully it's given you some insight or some information as to kind of what I've been doing in the meantime. Cool. Thanks for watching.